This episode is sponsored by Linode. Linode is offering listener servers in any of their 10 data centers, and their high memory plans start at 16 gigabytes. Get a server running in under a minute. They do hourly billing with a monthly cap on all plans, and add-on services like backups, node balancers, Longview, etc. VMs for full control, running Docker containers, encrypted disks, VPNs, etc. holidays, and a 7-day money-back guaranteed. So go check them out at linode.com/adventures in Angular. Hey everybody, and welcome to another Adventures in Angular show. This week on our panel we have Ward Bell.
Hello everyone.
Joe Eames.
Hey everybody.
Shai Reznik.
Coming to you live from 4 a.m. at Israel.
4 a.m., man. No, I'm so sorry.
11 p.m. It's okay.
Just get an attendee ticket. That's all it'll get you at this point is notified of the next one. But I have some other things coming down the pike that I'll let you know about soon. We have two special guests this week. We have Paul Spears.
Hello.
And John, is it Baur?
Baur, yes. Hi, everyone.
Kind of like Jack Bauer, right?
Yeah.
Just like that.
I'm a little cooler than he is.
That's right. You can save the world in 23 hours.
Exactly.
Do you guys want to introduce yourselves real quick? Let people know who you are, where you're from.
Sure. So it's Paul Spears here. I work at a tiny company called Oasis Digital Solutions. We're based out of St. Louis, but we also do Angular Bootcamp. I'm the lead curriculum author for that, and I go around with the crew here teaching Angular to businesses, public engagements, private engagements, the whole 9 yards there, consulting along with it. You want to learn or get better at Angular or need some help with tackling your problems in Angular, we get called in to help with that.
I'm John Baur, and Paul just stole most of my thunder, but I pretty much do the same thing he does.
Yep. So John and I, we go out, oftentimes not as part of the same class, but kind of in parallel, teaching Angular around the U.S. and the world.
Nice. Now, I know that Oasis Digital Angular Bootcamp, you have sort of established places where you do the boot camps, like St. Louis, for example. I think you also have one in New York and a few other cities. And then you also will go out to companies and do in-person training for them if they need, specific training on a particular topic with Angular.
That's correct. Yeah, we got DC, San Francisco, Washington, DC, London, St. Louis, and we're open to suggestions on kind of the next regular spot on the tour.
Yep. Also, in full disclosure, Angular Bootcamp is a sponsor of the show, so...
Yeah, we had to pay him to get on the show, but yeah, it'll be worth it.
Not true.
No.
Anyway, so yeah, let's dive in and talk about teaching Angular. I'm curious as we get started, besides kind of the established boot camps where you're teaching new people coming in, how much of the rest of it is helping people learn or transition to Angular versus, hey, we want to learn kind of the mid and upper tier of Angular knowledge?
Well, I would say the majority of it is teaching people new to Angular. A lot of people come in and they've been dabbling with, even if they've been dabbling with Angular for a little while, we find that they're not always using the best practices, and no fault of their own. There's just Angular's. We just want to dive in and learn the real heavy stuff, and we start teaching them the heavy stuff, and they go, "Wait, what was that? What was that thing you just did?" And so we tried splitting it into beginning and advanced courses, and what you would expect to happen happened, and nobody signed up for the beginner courses anymore. So we did away with that, and we found that even working with the most experienced developers, kind of starting fresh from the basics of Angular really gets them a good foundation to get going.
Yeah, we really target the class for people who are already professional developers and are just looking to add this to their toolbox. But that doesn't stop people who are like, you know what, I'm looking for a career change. I've heard that I need to get me some Angular. Where can I get some Angular? And they kind of arrive in one of our public classes. And that's where things get interesting. As every once in a while, we'll have a few students that just are trying to get their development career started, and they're just not ready for jumping straight to a framework. They got to get the basics of JavaScript, HTML, CSS, at least have a little bit of that sprinkled in to kind of get going. But the thing that we found most unique was actually that we got people that show up that are coming from a background of 20 years Java experience, 15 years C# experience. It's the wave of developers who are now coming in off of the big server-side development stacks and now arriving in the front end. They suddenly wake up and realize, I'm a front end developer now. I've got to figure this out. And those are the really interesting ones to teach because they come with this vast swath of knowledge, and they had these careers that even shadow mine very easily. And yet I'm the one teaching them about these new client side front end toys, if you will. And it's an interesting dynamic when that happens.
I think that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of sort of the Java, with my background, the people that I would normally talk to would say enterprise background, as opposed to, I've done Ruby on Rails for 10 years. And a lot of that time it was just like doing jQuery magic on the front end. And so a lot of folks that have been doing traditional web development now are seeing that frameworks are becoming, in a lot of ways, the new traditional web development. So I'm surprised you're not talking a little bit more about those folks too.
Yeah, we get a few sprinklings of that from time to time. And that's just not what we're seeing, though.
Wow.
Just a large, overwhelming majority of students that arrive in our class are from those .NET or Java backgrounds, of course, in the enterprise. But they're not coming from, Ruby, Grails, Python, anything really other than just Java, .NET. We
client-side programming in HTML and JavaScript for the first time. I mean, when they come from those other environments, are they used to building applications that are essentially rendered on the server? And this is their first time coming to single-page apps?
A lot of the time, yeah, this is the first time. Maybe they've dabbled in HTML, CSS a little, but we might be writing the first lines of JavaScript code they've ever done. And actually, I would say that teaching Angular now to the career backend developers is a lot easier than it was teaching Angular.js because they just seem to adapt to TypeScript much better than plain old ES5, which we used to do. So we've seen a big improvement in students picking up the material.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that this week, teaching one of my clients, thinking about how similar it got, when you learn the stuff you don't know coming from server background, you run into the same problems. Basically, you get in Java or .NET, the design patterns or the architecture decisions. So we're so close, but when you don't know what you don't know, it seems so far away.
Yeah, we oftentimes will get into a class and we'll be drumming up a reactive pattern and showing how cool this kind of design pattern is, or whenever we start talking things like let's talk about NGRX and kind of get a feel for how this kind of architecture might work, we'll oftentimes have a developer saying, oh, this is just like technology X, in this language that's been around forever, and you're like, oh, so you actually do know these design patterns. It's just they're just now emerging in the front end, and so it feels new to me, but they've been doing it forever.
Mm-hmm.
And do you see are Java and .NET background programmers pretty much similar in these respects? For example, the Java developers, they like TypeScript too, right? I mean, it feels kind of familiar to them, or do they have a harder time making that leap? Or
no, I think it's pretty much the same between those two sets of programmers.
Yeah, that seems to be my experience too.
So when they approach this, go ahead, Ward.
No, go ahead, Chuck.
I was just curious. When they approach Angular, then are they looking to back it onto a .NET or Java setup, or are they going completely to JavaScript and doing something like Express and Node.js?
Yeah, the first inclination they usually walk in with is, I've got to figure out how to make this .NET app use Angular. And usually throughout the course of the 3 days, about 2.5 days in, they kind of have this moment where they go, oh, I get it. I am not tied to technology X on the back end with what I'm learning and applying now in this class. I'm completely decoupled from that and kind of free to move about. So they're often coming to that understanding and realization in the class and not so much arriving with, this is my architecture, I got it all figured out. In private versus public offerings, though, the private classes have a completely different feel. Most of them have gone further down the road of discovery and kind of figured out, okay, I understand single page web apps and I can decouple my front end from my back end and kind of build those independently. And they've usually actually been using Angular for a while before we show up in those private engagements. So kind of two different crowds, but public classes, they come in, they say, I've got a Java or a .NET app. I'm using an MVC framework, and I need to figure out how to serve this Angular page. And by the time they leave, they kind of get it, and they start to reevaluate their server stack.
So, all right. So in order to talk about this, you kind of have to say which audience that is. So, let's pick one. Let's pick the ones that really don't have the experience. How do you organize their encounter with single-page apps in general and Angular in particular?
Can you restate that?
Okay, let me try again. So how do you bring them along? What's your sort of agenda for them as you try and expose them to programming on the client in TypeScript and HTML using Angular? What's the sequence?
Yeah, so that's the trick, right? As answering that question. That's really a challenge, and there's not an exact science because everyone's going to learn different. They're going to come in with different kind of backgrounds, but we generally, what are they? What differentiates them? And start to really try and motivate them and get them excited for this change, because some of them aren't even necessarily looking to make the change. They don't realize that change is even coming. They just know that their team is moving to Angular and they need to get on board. And so we actually have to start by getting that motivation and helping kind of walk through, replay some of the history of how we've arrived at single page app architecture. And then with arming everyone with that, they get excited about, okay, great, I see this. And now Angular is arriving to help provide me a framework for building this, that I can tie those concepts, those ideas, those practices I've already learned in the back end, and now apply them to Angular in this front-end framework and continue to build at a higher level of abstraction with the better tools available to us in the client today. So it's really about motivation, in my opinion. John, you got anything to add to that?
No, that was well stated. I really think, it's a big hurdle to get over, but I know it's a small thing we need to get over. But I've found that, like you said, by the end of the class, whether they're coming from a jQuery background or they're coming from a .NET background, everybody seems to get a grasp on that pretty well.
Okay, so how do you? A lot of us have tried this, and one of the first things that we run into is that the folks in the audience are drowning from all of the new technology we're throwing at them. It's the first time they've seen TypeScript. It's the first time they've seen Node and NPM and the whatever IDE you're using, and all these packages that suddenly show up, and all this ceremony and stuff, and how do you cope with that? And I'll bet you use the CLI, but you might as well tell people that's what you do.
Yeah, but I was about to join this question and ask also, you do it in 3 days, right? So what do you cover in 3 days? Like, what can you cover in 3 days? Like Ward said, it's like a whole ecosystem of things.
Yeah, and we noticed that when we first started. We started doing this Angular Bootcamp for the new version of Angular when it was it was still in alpha when we were teaching it. And we just tried, diving straight in and talking about ES6. We do some hand waving at the beginning, and we don't really talk about Node and NPM until day 2 maybe. And even then, we kind of ease them into it. We have to go over TypeScript. I mean, it's based around TypeScript now, but we try to ease them into that. So we come in. We're using maybe a brand new IDE, but we allow them to use whatever IDE they want to edit their code. We start going over the basics of TypeScript, and usually, like I said before, this is a lot better for these people with a lot of server-side backgrounds because they're used to a more object-oriented language. So we don't lose as many people there.
A constructor, like what makes that a constructor? Just explaining the warts of JavaScript. We get to take that away and get to add something newer and niftier to it.
They just understand what I'm talking about, and we can go into the technical parts later after we have a better understanding of the framework.
So do you just not talk about it's the first hours or so, and when they're first doing Angular, do you just skip? You just say, hey folks, just do what I'm doing here. Load your, say, NPM, install CLI, and just follow along with me, and I'll explain why you did all that later, and try and pretend it's not there.
So we do a little bit of magic, actually, in our class. We come in with a zip file that you can download off our website once you kind of know the secret link, if you will, and then you get that download, and inside it we've actually pre-compiled Angular and the TypeScript compiler into a JavaScript file. And so the kit that we give them, you can actually run the whole thing without any tooling, make changes to your code base, hit save, and it will actually recompile that in the browser. And we put on their big disclaimers, and we have a little bit of opening ceremony about how this file should really be called. Please don't ever use this after we're done with this class. It is totally just a toy to get you started without tooling. .js. And so we kind of give them that kit. That way we can defer the conversations about NPM installing, CLI building, bundling, Webpack, TypeScript compiling, TS configs. All of that goes away until they've actually bought in, if you will. They've had a chance to kind of see the wow, see the awesome. And then all right, I like this now. And then we jump straight to CLI, like you mentioned.
Yeah, it's because that first hour is crucial. I mean, if you spend that first hour with 30 people on a spotty network doing NPM install, Angular CLI, and then an ng new, you're going to lose a lot of people right away. They're not even going to give you a chance.
Yeah, that sets the tone pretty hard for 3 days.
Yeah, I've been through that one. It seems, particularly when you've got a crowded room, all hammering the Wi-Fi at the same time.
Right.
It's tough. So that's a really interesting approach, and I find that valuable. I bet other people who are trying to get people on board would find that valuable too.
Yeah, what's really neat is that also allows us to do a similar thing with our online classes. We actually point them at an online IDE within a little bitty VM that it's served with, and we actually have a script that can run and automate the downloading of that script for them. So they start off, they run a single command, it downloads our script, and then that script then unpacks the kit that doesn't require NPM. And they're able to get started right away that way as well.
But still, even so, first of all, cool magic tricks. That's great to hear because it do save time. But still, you have the complexity of Angular itself once you get over the tooling. Even if you do use this CLI, you still have all the what's that main TS file and what the hell does that do, and all the process, the bootstrap process, which is kind of 5-step process until you get to the actual HTML part, which is easy.
Yeah, we approach that kind of what was this kind of this golden rule, the best way to tell a story is to start in the middle. and kind of walk through how you got here. Like that's kind of like that's classic trope of building up a story. You start in the middle, and you get them interested in engaged in how we got here, and then you go back, and then from there kind of tell them those bits. And so what that translates to for this class is we say, yes, there is a main TS file. Don't worry about that. We're going to talk about the heart of what Angular is. The heart of Angular is about building these components. And so we just show them at the start some components, and we show them where those files are, and they can go in, they can edit those files, see those changes, and they get that immediate feedback, that immediate kind of those positive vibes as they start immediately editing and changing some code and seeing that their changes propagate to the screen. And they know nothing about any main TSs or app TS or any of the config files that might actually be sitting on disk there. We kind of just say, look right here for now. We're going to put a box around it, and we're going to slowly expand that view as you get comfortable working from the inside out.
So you start with the templates and stuff like that, and walk your way backwards.
Right, yeah, because it's real easy to start at the components. And when asked, why are we starting here, we can very easily point at words right on the Angular docs and Angular website saying, look, this is a framework for building these things. This is kind of the unit of work that we're most interested in. So it's a sensible place to start.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Actually, we tried that one. We had a version of our, we being the Angular docs, a version of the Quick Start that completely hid the main and all that other stuff, and just dove right in to your first Hello World component. And I really liked that. The reason we had to backtrack was because we didn't have a human voice there to tell them not that you can't actually do that. And so people were pissed that we gave them something that they immediately had to throw away. But you're there, human faces, and so you get to tell them, okay, so I kind of lied a little bit here in order to get you going. And so I could see why that would be effective in person.
Whenever I have a new idea for an app, one of the first things I do is go find a domain name for it. The company I use and have used for years is hover.com. Hover.com has a clean and easy-to-use interface. They don't try to upsell me on a bunch of services I don't want or need, and they provide free whois masking for the domains I register. So if I register a domain that's not directly tied to devchat.tv, people don't need to know that I'm the one that owns it. They also offer domains with all kinds of top-level domains like .codes and .computer, and others like .coffee and .pizza. So when you have your next idea strike, go to hover.com/adventures to get it. Once again, that's hover.com/adventures. So one thing that I'm curious about here is, the tooling and the CLI. You're talking about kind of short-circuiting that part of the learning process to just get them in and get them building something, which is totally my speed, right? I mean, the reason that I haven't made it through any Angular tutorials except for one on Angular Material is because it took way too long to get things together, and then they were explaining this is a component, and this is a this, and this is a that, and so I just go play with it and learn it that way. And so I love that. But is the CLI and the tooling and the all of the other stuff there, is that where people tend to get hung up, or is it just too much all at once at the beginning to get them going?
It's really the fact that it's too much all at once at the beginning. It's usually the end of the first day, beginning of the second day. We do have people go through the steps to install the Angular CLI. And then we start talking about, we don't go deep into the process of what the CLI is doing under the hood, but we talk about it a little bit, show them some of the configuration options, and start really making use of it. So we don't completely ignore it. We just put it off until, like Paul said before, they're bought in.
Well, there's also some homework. Whenever a student signs up for the class, they get something from us saying, hey, we're going to walk in here and we're going to end up needing to install NPM, and we're going to install it like that. Their companies are getting more okay with that. So their employees are arriving at our class mostly with NPM installed anymore. And I
was going to ask, what are like the ratios of students being prepared versus not? When in the beginning, was it really low and now it's like 80% or something?
Oh, hey, Alyssa.
Welcome.
Yeah, well, it definitely started at 0 because we didn't send out that homework. I'd say it's closer to a 90% now. I mean, at minimum. It's gotten really good.
Yeah,
that's just eased a lot of pain, and it's freed up a lot of time to teach. When you're teaching 3 days, 8 hours a day, I mean, if you look at it, that's, I can't
24
do math.
hours.
24 hours. Man.
Math is hard.
But so yeah, you got 24 hours there. If you lose 2 of those hours to set up, that's a big chunk. Yeah. So getting those 2 hours back has really increased what we can talk about in 3 days.
So one of the things that I know many of us have struggled with is ngMod, and everybody, including people who really know what they're doing, struggle with it. So what do you have any secret sauce for getting that idea across?
There's no way to slice and dice that we've found that makes it a home run to teach. Walk back from there. That's kind of my spin on it. I try and take to get them there, to kind of motivate them to want such a layer of so can you explain again, module versus component versus TS module? They still want to conflate those ideas, and some of these topics, it just takes time to sit and stew in those ideas before it clicks.
So you start with a single app root module at the beginning and just say, hey, look, to keep Angular happy, you got to throw your declarations in here, and we'll get back to this later. Is that kind of how you approach it? Because in order to get 2 components, in order to get your first component beyond app component, you got to do it. Or maybe you just let the CLI hide the whole thing. I don't know.
Yeah, so we tackled the app module. We actually have kind of like this numbered curriculum that we walk through while they're building, and we actually intentionally defer. So kind of like going back to starting in the middle, that's part of the story that we skip in the beginning. We actually defer opening up that module file until exactly what you said. Like, all right, we've now played with one component and seen what we can do with one component. Now we have 2. So now that we have 2, how do we get this template to understand where these components come from? And then we open up our app module and we kind of slot that in there and say, now we have a way of inform until we get to talking about more than one module.
Yeah. Yeah. So you just sort of say, hey, this is the registry. You got to tell Angular. Here, just go put it there. and if I need a service that's everywhere, hey, you want it to, just stick it right in there. Is that kind of the way you let it happen?
No, I mean, we do more justice to the module system fairly early on. When we teach routing, we actually start right out of the gate with lazy loaded routing as kind of the default. That has its own kind of hiccups teaching, but it's one of those things that we felt would be a better way, because if you teach them the simple version of routing, they're just going to turn their nose up at seeing, the more justifiably more complex syntax for lazy loading and never commit to learning it while we're there to help them. And so we kind of start with, here's how you route. And so we kind of dive right into needing to understand the module system, to understand routing, how we're putting our components in one versus the other, et cetera.
Yeah, I think we've actually started hitting that pretty hard early on. Like you said, we've got numbered steps at the beginning, and I think it's like 3 or 4, we introduce our second component. And then right after that, we introduce our, adding another module and drive in the point that, hey, you have to do this if you want to take advantage of lazy loading. And the very next step is then showing them how to do lazy loading so they don't forget that concept. So I think organizing it in that way has helped students kind of be okay with those modules a little earlier on.
Earlier in the show, you mentioned some best practices that people tend not to follow when you show up to people that are companies that are already using Angular. Is this one of those things, or are there other things?
I would say one of the things is, dumping everything in one module. Another one is not dividing up components very granularly. And so they'll have components on the screen, but those components may be the component classes may be several hundred lines long. And
that's a feature.
Yeah.
Was somebody gurgling just now?
That was me laughing.
That was word remembering.
So let's be clear that let's be clear. That's not you laughing at them. Like, that's you laughing at yourself at some point, right? Because we've all been there. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
I would never admit to that.
And you like Star Wars also.
Oh, yeah. I was also laughing at you having one, going right to lazy module, multiple modules, because Joe here used to, several shows ago, opine that you should have one and only one module. I wonder if he still feels that way. Joe?
Joe, are you still doing it wrong?
Yeah, he's still taking the code of silence on that one.
I actually don't disagree with Joe on this. I feel that the one module thing is good for a while, and I can do a lot of teaching. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying I was afraid to go that way.
I think there is another good reason to split stuff into modules. So I actually struggled with all that stuff preparing. I did a lecture in Poland called "The Legend of NG Models," which explain about the modules and how Brad Green is the king of Angular. But besides that, so I thought hard about it and figured out that even when you get to a certain point where you have more than, 10 components or even sometimes less, but when you get to a certain point, we have lots of services or components. That's a good way to split up the configuration of like setting it all up in one big module, because your module can get up to like lots of lines, and then you try to figure out what's in there and is it cohesive enough and all that stuff. So that's also a good excuse, I think, to maybe teach about, now we need another module to maybe
try and make sure that we're holding all of our instructors to, is that we oftentimes get into this pattern of assuming that our view of the world and the shapes of the problems that we're solving are the same as all of our students. And that's something that's really important to try and remember walking into these classes, is that you don't know what kind of problem they're trying to solve. And what you might be selling could be the wrong thing for the kind of app they're building. The strongest kind of divider of this is, are you building an application or are you building a library for your company to consume? Like, the way you build those looks very different. And what features of Angular you take advantage of will look very different. And so, like the module thing, we go down the route of lazy loading, but it's kind of the motivating example. And those three features are clearly divided along these boundaries. And so modules are a perfect fit. If we go into a company where they're actually building a mobile application, and it might have 5 screens, but those 5 screens are all going to get used frequently together. Yeah, use one module. That makes complete sense for that scenario. Or if you're making a library and it's just a collection of widgets that you want to import once and use, yeah, one module is great for that scenario. So it's, you can't get it all right because the scenarios are so wildly different.
Yeah, I think it goes back a little to what Ward was talking about earlier, and it's something that's a lot easier to do in person than to write down in in documentation somewhere, because we can tell you this is how you do it. Well, unless, and then kind of speak to
complex when you go into that. Okay, now you need to lazy load. Now you need to be aware not to add any providers to your shared module and all that stuff. So that's where things get a little bit, I think, edgy or
harder.
Harder.
They get really knowing anything about them, and then slowly dropping one little thought in at a time. So it'll be interesting to see how these things come out.
About kind of knowing the audience and knowing that there are many different kind of apps out there. We have to pick, we got 3 days. We've got to pick one kind of app to frame the lessons in, like one category. And the category that we pick is what we know best. We do enterprise development. We do screens that have many kinds of complex interactions with asynchronous data and asynchronous inputs flowing all over the place. And so that's where we're at home. And that's where to put something like NGRX into play, if at all, is within that category of app. And so that's kind of the path we take through the learning of Angular. Of course, being able to call out to other examples as needed, depending on the class.
I have another important question, just really quickly. Before we get into picks. Did someone ever bite you during one of the boot camps?
So it was a close call. It was a bit of a shave there. This was actually back in Angular.js. I was teaching a class, and it was a room full of people. It was one of our largest in-person classes that we've ever done. And I was explaining how the scope works. So this is back like 1.3, Angular 1.3. And so you still had to understand the behavior of how $scope worked and what it was and what it actually meant to put a nested component in it and access scope. So I was deep in an explanation of that. And raises his hand, and he asks for clarification, and I state it again. And out of nowhere, he just blurts out, "That is stupid!" And he just starts come back to reality. And it's just like, at the end of the day, I'm like, look, I'm sorry. Like, I didn't mean to be the bearer of bad news. I'm just telling you how JavaScript works. And he's like, that's not how JavaScript works. This is just stupid. I love JavaScript. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but you apparently didn't use it enough to get to that point yet. And kind of left it at that and had to move on. But it was just really weird just having a student yell at me for like the way a thing behaved. I'd never experienced that before. So yeah, that was a fun
Thank you.
class.
Thank you for the elaborated answer. I was like talking about physically, like somebody biting your hand while you're trying to show him something. But sorry, Chuck, it was supposed to be like a really quick, silly question and a really quick, silly answer of no.
It's fine.
Well, here, Shai, I'll have you know, I taught Mike Tyson Angular, and I lost an ear to that. Yeah,
right on the ear.
Right on the ear. I had one more just like that. You guys teach any testing in these 3 days?
On errors, crashes, and performance problems affecting your end users. You can replicate issues in seconds rather than digging through log files and having to rely on users to report errors or crashes. Raygun gives you a window and 10-day trial by going to raygun.com and signing up today. No, it's all good. Let's make Shai go first. Shai, you have some picks for us?
Yeah, okay. So I have two Angular, so really fun to read. So I recommend that. I also have another thing, which is the Angular Performance Checklist by Minko Gechev. He released it as a GitHub page, which is kind of cool if you have performance issues. And I'll mention that the HiRes.io, my website, and it's really, really cool and funny and try to teach you like the fastest way possible all the weird things we're talking about. So that's it. Those are my picks.
Nice. Miko gave a talk about the Angular Performance Checklist at Angular Dev Summit. So if you're interested in that, I guess talk to me and we'll figure something out. Ward, what are your picks?
I am going to save my picks for another show because we have lots. We've really used up a lot of time here. So next time.
All right, Alyssa, what are your picks?
I just have one pick. It's an Atom package built by a dude named Joel Bezida, I think is how you say it, and code at one time instead of getting distracted. And so it's actually been hilariously fun. And after you get so many combos in a row, it starts shaking your screen and there's little fireworks pixels that go off. It's hilarious. So yeah, give it a try. It's a lot of fun. It's called Active Power Mode.
All right, Joe, what are your picks?
I just got one pick. TV show, Better Off Ted. It's an older show. It's totally awesome. Was recently watching it. Great show. There you go. That's my pick.
Nice. I'm going to throw just one quick pick out. I've talked about the keto diet that I've been doing on the show. It's been helping me. His wife makes keto-friendly cheesecake, and it was awesome. So I'll find the recipe and put a link in the show notes. But yeah.
Yes, is my first pick. It's this really neat emerging library framework for making reusable web components. It's built with TypeScript, and so it's got typed all the way through. You just run a build command, and your component comes out the other end. Really cool. You should check it out. The other one is a site I made called Angular Performance Playground. It kind of takes those ideas that actually Minko talks about in his performance checklist. I also have a similar talk that I had given, but it used those kinds of ideas to build a highly performant neat visual application that you can play around with, turn some knobs and see how it performs. And then, that was it. Thanks.
All right, John, what are your picks?
I'm going to go with a non-techie pick. I'm actually kind of a board game enthusiast, and so my first pick is that if you haven't played any modern board games, you start to get into them because it's an emerging scene that's a lot of fun. And once you get into it, I've been playing a lot of a game called Terraforming Mars. It is what it sounds like. You're cultivating the planet of Mars to be inhabited by society, and a lot of fun. So that's my pick.
Nice. Yeah, Joe and I used to get together every month with a bunch of other local
awesome
devs to play board games. That's fun.
Yep. And that's a great game, by the way. Mars, love it.
All right. Well, if people want to learn more about Angular Bootcamp, which, as we said, is a 3-day thing.
Dates where you can inquire to buy individual tickets or tickets for your company. And it's got all the information you'll need.
All right. And then for each of you, if people want to see what you're working on individually or things like that, talks or whatever, generally I'm looking for like Twitter, GitHub, anywhere else you tend to post, or a blog.
Yep. So my Twitter is at DPS3. Got that in the chat for you. And then my GitHub is /DPS3 as well. Oops.
My Twitter is at John R. Bauer. And I believe my GitHub is the same.
This was a really interesting, just deep dive into
thanks.
Where people are coming from and how they're getting there. So, we'll wrap it up and we'll catch y'all next week.
All right, cool. Thanks for having us.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.